Before the election, I said that we would face the worst inheritance since the Second World War.
Our policies are fully funded, fully costed. No ifs, no ands, no buts, no additional tax rises. Who said that?
Well, we did, Nick, and it's true.
Oh, good. So there will be no tax increases.
And we know that Paul Johnson from the IFS has pointed out that 20 billion figure is pretty much exactly the same as Jeremy Hunt's pre-election national insurance cut. That's quite convenient, isn't it?
Well...
Be an easy change to make.
In terms of advice on tax, that's an interesting representation. But the point of today is it is even worse than we thought, because there are things that we've discovered that weren't spoken about.
In today's video, we're going to talk about the black hole and these two having a bit of a standoff all over a black hole of 20 billion in the budget that no one seems to be able to account for. But we're going to dive a bit deeper because we're going to talk about trains, hospitals, coronavirus and Brexit. So at the beginning we listened to a Labour MP describe how they've discovered a 20 billion black hole. So let's have a listen to this Conservative MP justify that 20 billion black hole, or that it doesn't exist.
So the Chancellor says there is a £20 billion black hole in the public finances that your government left behind. Where is the money?
Well, I think the Chancellor is unfortunately setting out a narrative that is going to lead to Labour putting up taxes. But we should really start with some of the facts. And we all know, it's agreed on, that when Labour came into government on the 5th of July, they took over a strong economic legacy. They took over the fastest growing economy in the G7.
While true for that quarter, it's not true in general. In fact, we came out of a recession in the last 2 quarters of 23.
They took over inflation back down to 2%.
Which, while true, is quite funny because when it's at a high inflation rate, it's down to global matters, but when it's low inflation rate, it's down to Conservative policy.
They took over historically low unemployment.
And the low employment rate is down to the fact we haven't got enough people. We also have people leaving in hundreds of thousands, 600,000 in 23, 500,000 in 22, but also a very low birth rate, meaning we need about 400,000 a year just to make up for the fact that people aren't having kids.
And the deficit halved since we came into government in 2010.
They may have halved the deficit, but just listen to Stephen Fry take down another Conservative MP on them trying to brag about how good the economy was under them.
No, come on, look, unemployment was much, much higher, deficit was much, much higher, you name it, we were worse
GDP
off.
was roughly equivalent with America then. It's now half after your watch. That's pretty bad.
So they took over a really strong economic position.
Did we? The cost of living had hit all groups and was pretty much at an all-time high. High streets are slowly dying out, and in part that's because the cost of living is going up, meaning people can't afford to go out and buy stuff, or 14 million people, including 4 million children, are living in abject poverty. In fact, the poverty was so acute and desperate, the UN stepped in. And part of this problem is obviously the rich and Brexiteers shunting the money out the UK.
Yes, of course, there are always pressures in finances, but I think, as I said right at the start, what Labour is doing here is setting out a plan that is going to lead to them putting up taxes.
And I thought Brexit was meant to solve a lot of these problems, but of course it's not. And I'm working on some calculations at the moment, but I'm looking at a cost to fix the damage of Brexit being somewhere between 500 billion and 1 trillion. And if the figure is correct, that means you're going to have to pay higher taxes.
Things that the party opposite covered up. Covered up from the opposition, covered up from this House, covered up from the country. That is why we're today publishing a detailed audit of the real spending situation, a copy of which will be laid in the House of Commons library. I was alerted by officials that this was not how much the previous government expected to spend this year. It wasn't even close. In fact, the total pressures on these budgets across a range of areas was an additional £35 billion. Once you account for the slippage in budgets you usually see over a year and the reserve of £9 billion designed to respond to genuinely unexpected events, it means, Mr. Speaker, that we have inherited a projected overspend of £22 billion.
Within that sentence, we've just had a confirmation that austerity is back.
A £22 billion hole in the public finances now. Not in the future, but now. £22 billion of spending this year. They had exhausted the reserve, and they knew that, but nobody else did. Yet they ducked the difficult decisions. They put party before country. And they continued And they continue to make unfunded commitment after unfunded commitment, knowing that the money was not there.
We're going to come back to that statement a little bit later, as well as the angry Mr. Jeremy Hunt and his response, and I've got some thoughts on that. But first, I wanted to talk about another thing that got brought up, and that's the hospitals.
Leadership on this issue has paved the way to ending a dispute which has caused waiting lists to spiral, operations to be delayed, and agony for patients to be prolonged.
I love how Wes Streeting was taunting opposition with the words 3 weeks over and over again. Yes, finally we have something positive to talk about. The Labour government in 3 weeks has managed to resolve the dispute with junior doctors.
In October 2020, the government announced that 40 new hospitals would be built.
Remember this Brexit bonus.
A programme of 40 new hospitals. It will cost a lot of money, but we've got to start. This is the moment for our country to invest in the NHS for the long term. We have the funds to do it. We're going to make the funds available.
Since then, only one new project has opened to patients, and only 6 have started their main construction activity. The National Audit Office were clear that delivery was wildly off track. But since coming into office, it has become clear that the previous government continued to maintain its commitment to 40 hospitals without anywhere close to the funding required to deliver them. That gave our constituents false hope. We need to be straight with the British people about what is deliverable and what is affordable. So we will conduct a complete review of the new hospital programme with a thorough, realistic and costed timetable for delivery.
Remember this by any chance?
This ward is not safe for the children, right? There was one registrar covering the entirety of this ward and the neonatal unit. That is just not acceptable, is it? I mean, would you like that for your children? There are not enough people on this ward. There are not enough doctors, there are not enough nurses, it's not well organised enough. Right. The NHS has been destroyed. Right. It's been destroyed, and now you come here for a press opportunity.
Well, actually, there's no press here.
What do you mean there's no press here? Who are these people?
I'm the hospital chief executive. We're here to actually find out what we can do to refurbish this hospital.
Well, that's not going to fix things now. It's a bit late, isn't it? I mean, years of this NHS being destroyed. And you're telling me there's no press here? Well, there's no press here.
As far as I'm aware, this is not
This is the press opportunity. You didn't invite the press here. You didn't ask them to come. You don't have a press handler back there. Okay, well, fine. Well, in your la-la land, believe whatever you want. Thank you.
You would hope something like that would be drilled into his head, the importance of getting these hospitals built, but no, that man would rather party. And I think it takes us in another direction with all this. Bear in mind that who are you meant to believe? Is it the Conservatives telling us the truth, or is it the Labour Party? Who's got the worst track record for lies, lies, and more lies? Next, we talk about trains.
In the wake of the pandemic, demand for rail services fell. But instead of developing a proper plan to adjust for this new reality, the government handed out cash to rail companies to make up for passenger shortfalls, but failed to budget for this adequately. Because of that, and because of industrial action, there is now an overspend of £1.6 billion in the transport budget. That was unfunded, and it was undisclosed.
And then there's COVID, which I find particularly galling, as Jeremy Hunt was the person in charge for about a decade of our health and pandemic preparations, and frankly did nothing.
Willing at least to concede, given the impartial assessment by the House of Commons Library that COVID cost this country between 310 and 410 billion pounds, that the previous government did a pretty good job in getting inflation down to 2% less than 2 years after the pandemic.
Not an apology for having no pandemic preparations, not an apology for 240,000 that died, not an apology for not even putting up a statue to all those nurses and doctors that saved all of those lives. No, he wants kudos for inflation, which when goes up, they refuse to take any credit for, but when it goes down, they want to take the credit for. And he's just done it again.
The pandemic is no excuse for making unfunded spending commitments, and that is precisely what the government did. And given that the honourable gentleman mentioned the pandemic, during the pandemic, the party opposite handed out contracts to friends and donors of their party in a VIP lane, which is why we are appointing a COVID corruption commissioner, because we want that money back in our public services where it belongs.
Conservatives had several years in which to collect evidence and start a commission and start prosecuting all of those that made money. But of course, they're never going to do that because they were the ones that gave out the contracts.
Honestly see there's a case to answer. I can't see what we've done wrong. Doug and the consortium have simply delivered a contract, a delivery contract of goods.
And then there's Brexit. Remember all of this?
We can see the sunlit meadows beyond.
There will be broad sunlit uplands.
There will be no downside to Brexit at all and considerable upside.
Well, there was a particularly scathing remark and quite shocking statistic relating to industry.
They failed to support industry too. And just the figures today demonstrate this point. Britain has dropped out of the top 10 countries for manufacturing for the first time since the Industrial Revolution.
Where have we heard about that issue before?
It's perfectly true that if you remove protection of the sort that has been given in particular to the car industry and to other manufacturing industries inside the protective wall, you have got you're going to have a change in the situation facing that industry, and you are going to have to run it down, and it will be in your interest to do it just in the same way that we ran down the coal industry and the steel industry. These things happen as evolution takes place in your economy, and in the long run, they're in your interest.
So I very much welcome my right honourable friend's commitment to leverage in billions more in private investment to make up for the record low levels of private investment that we saw under the party opposite.
And we're starting to see a repetition of problem here because they're not talking about the issues of Brexit. And part of the reason that we've been lacking foreign direct investment is because of Brexit. The economy's unstable, they don't know what they're doing, and it looks like the population will back in.
And I too saw those numbers today that showed that Britain was out of the top 10 of manufacturing countries, which is shameful given our history and being at the heart of the Industrial Revolution. I'd also like to pay tribute to my honourable friend for the work that he's done in ensuring that Labour went into this election as the most pro-business party at this election. The reforms that we've already announced in the first 3 weeks, planning reforms, the creation of a National Wealth Fund, reform of our pension system and a modern industrial strategy, are how we will go about making Britain the best place to start and grow a business and the best place to invest. And we look forward to holding our International Investment Summit in the UK later this year.
And yet that's the entire point of Brexit, the Singapore-on-Thames, to deindustrialise, to stop manufacturing stuff. Because according to Brexiteers, the aim is to be a free market enterprise and just have stuff imported. But of course you need an industrial base because it helps the economy. And it's very difficult to compete with countries that are several billion in size and population and have a huge industrial capacity. That's why you put up trade barriers. But of course they don't want to do that. So let's go to the next day. And it's Rachel Reeves being interviewed, and she's being put on the spot as to whether or not Jeremy Hunt is a liar.
In the speech that the past government covered up a £22 billion hole in the public finances. Are you saying that Jeremy Hunt is a liar?
Jeremy Hunt covered up from the House of Commons and from the country the true state of the public finances. He did that knowingly and deliberately.
So he's a liar? If he covered something up knowingly, he's a liar?
He lied, and they lied during the election campaign about the state of the public finances.
Now, if Jeremy Hunt really wanted to take this on, if he really wanted to clear his name, he'd sue her for libel. There's a little-known rule that inside Parliament, inside the Commons, you can say whatever you like without fear of prosecution. That's why some MPs in the past have wound up Nigel Farage and made accusations about him having Russian connections. Well, let's see what Jeremy Hunt has to say, because I'm finding that really interesting, and I'm assuming that's why she hesitated in saying it out in public. But now she said it in public, that means Jeremy can sue her for libel.
The reality is that
Are you angry? Are you insulted by this? I mean, she called you a liar.
Of course, but I'm disappointed more than anything else. I mean, the reality is that we had good plans to deal with the pressures in public finances.
Just bear in mind, this is the same guy who had 8 years to prepare us for a pandemic and did nothing.
Based on productivity in the public sector.
Translation, if you want a pay rise, you've got to work more.
Welfare reform.
Most of the people that are unemployed or on welfare have a variety of reasons, whether that's pensioners or people who are long-term sick. Jeremy is now talking about how they would reform that, which is a nice way of saying cuts, cuts, cuts.
And the Rwanda scheme to deter illegal migrants.
And again, back to the same old language, one of the things I would like someone to push back on is going, what about if they're a genuine refugee and they can't get here? Therefore, they're not an illegal migrant. That term doesn't work. As a refugee, you just have to get here. I find that really interesting that he's using same old tropes and essentially mildly racist language.
Now, Labour has chosen not to go ahead with those plans. They're perfectly legitimately entitled to do that as the new government. But yesterday, Rachel Reeves approved £9 billion of pay rises for public sector workers without asking for any productivity improvements in return.
So they haven't had a pay rise in line with inflation, which means they are working more or the same for less money. And what he wanted to do, and this is probably why it's stalled, is to make them work harder for the amount of money that they should be earning. Bit of a joke.
Which is what we would have done, indeed, what we did last year. That makes them much more affordable. She chose not to do that.
And then they bring up a very good question. Why were they spending our reserves meant for a pandemic?
But there is about £10 billion of spending, which you were funding through reserves, and the reserves were being blown out from what was available. Now, there's nothing wrong with funding extra spending through reserves, but if you know just a couple of months into a fiscal year that the reserves are going to be used that very same year multiple times over, could you and should you not have notified Parliament?
Well, let's look at the what that money constituted. £6.5 billion, the bulk of it was for asylum claims. And we had a plan. We were warned by the Home Office that the asylum bill could be up to £11 billion a year by 2026. That number was in the public domain. And so we had a plan to deal with it. It was the Rwanda plan.
He's spending money now to prevent a plan that is going to be implemented in 2026. What is he talking about? The two policies here are you just try and shoo these people away, which isn't really viable, or you get them in and then get them working as soon as possible, which is the Labour plan. Which one sounds more sensible?
Now, I had to take very difficult decisions when I became Chancellor. I had to increase taxes, cut spending by £30 billion a year, increase taxes by £20 billion a year, much bigger sums than we've been talking about yesterday. I didn't go around studios blaming Labour for it. I just said that this is, we've had a pandemic.
But you couldn't have blamed Labour for it because you were in power.
Yes, but I took responsibility. I didn't blame any of my predecessors. I took responsibility for the situation we faced.
Maybe you should have done. Where's the money? Why are people having to pay higher mortgage rates because of Liz Truss? Why isn't she being bankrupted to somehow compensate these people for her stupidity? And he's then turning around and suggesting, it's not a problem. I don't blame others.
And I think that is honest politics.
Honest politics would have been getting Liz Truss to pay compensation out of her own pocket to all of those that she affected. But he's not going to do that because she's part of the Conservative Party. That's not honest politics. That's protecting your party over country. That's protecting Liz Truss over all the people whose lives she damaged. And then we come to a final and important question that no one in the media asked, but Steve Bray did.
What about that 40 billion black hole of Brexit? 100 billion in revenue that would generate? Thank you.
Brexit has done nothing but damage. It's increased your taxes. So what are you going to do about it? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Once again, thank you for listening to the show. And thank you to all my Patreon and YouTube supporters who keep this channel going and growing. By giving me a bit of extra cash, I can buy coffee, which keeps me up all night being able to make these type of videos. Once again, thanks for listening. Bye for now.